because that's the question I want to answer for people, because that's what I see people failing to do. Like, that's the most common thing. I just see people not quite able to take care of themselves in some aspect of their life. And it's not that people are incompetent, and it's not that people don't have the capacity or the capability. It's just that the information that's out there is often contradictory. Hello, and welcome to the How to Take Care of Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Veronica Wolff-Casey, and I am thrilled that you are here. This podcast is all about how we can take care of ourselves with all the different modalities that are out there. So I'm an Ayurvedic medical practitioner and Ayurvedic yoga therapist, as well as a chef. And as we'll learn in today's episode, I have quite a bit of experience from health from all different angles, including the Air Force. So join me for this episode as my best friend, Mona Warner, who is also an Ayurvedic doctor, takes us on a little journey behind my scenes so that you can find out who I am and what I'm all about. Do me a favor, though, before you even start listening to the rest of this episode, hit the subscribe button so we can keep bringing you this content. I do hope you'll stay with us. We're really glad you're here. Hi, Mona.
Hi, Veronica. So, hi, everyone, and welcome. I am not your host. I am Mona Warner, but I am here to introduce your host, Veronica Wolff-Casey, in our inaugural first episode of the How to Take Care of Yourself podcast. So, to be clear, not the host. However, supporting the host because we thought a really fun way of launching the podcast would be an episode where Veronica gets interviewed on her own podcast. We just thought that was spectacular. So here we go. Unless V, you have something you want to add before I dive into the Spanish Inquisition on you.
No, I'm just super thrilled that you were able to be here, and I think this is going to be a blast. I'm so excited.
All right. We begin where things begin. Origin story. Like all superheroes, Veronica has an origin story. So, Veronica, it would be really good for our audience to hear a little bit about your origin story, your journey. How did you find Ayurveda? What brought you here? Why do you continue on this path? A lot of people sort of step in and then step out.
It's super true. And I think you and I see that a lot, especially in our careers, how people do just step out. And I've never wanted to step out. So I started my career in healthcare, actually in the United States military. I was in the Air Force for 6 years as what's called a bioenvironmental engineer, which is like a cross between a medic and a nuclear, biological, chemical warfare specialist. It makes me sound like I'm like some kind of superhero. I'm really not, but I'm incredibly good in emergencies. But while I was in the military, I really thought I wanted to be an emergency room doctor. Really thought that's what I wanted to do. And so I was trying to take advantage of the Air Force and the military's programs through secondary education. So I actually started pre-med on this tip that I was going to be an emergency room doctor. But as I studied and as I was a first responder in my career in the military, I realized more and more that I thought and felt that the real journey for health for people had to start earlier than when the emergency happened. Right? Because it's like by then, I mean, obviously there's some emergencies we can't avoid, like a car accident or something like that. But so many of the patients that are seen in emergency rooms are things that potentially were preventable if we had interventions early on. And so that actually started my journey into complementary and alternative medicine. So I didn't know what Ayurveda was at that point. Started taking a lot of yoga, really got deep into my yoga practice. I was an ex-dancer, so it seemed like a natural progression. Started studying yoga and teaching yoga while I was in the military, while I was deployed to Kyrgyzstan. I had not taken a YTT. This is an interesting fact. just decided I should start teaching yoga. No qualifications at all, other than I had been a dancer and I had taken a bunch of yoga classes. And I'm like a mina bird. I can teach anything. You just tell me what needs to be taught. And so I finally got out of the military and went and took a real yoga teacher training to become a yoga teacher. The whole time I was studying complementary and alternative medicine. And then at the end of my YTT, my friend, Ruth Knell, and she'll probably remember this if she hears this episode, she had a Kripalu catalog in her office. She's a acupuncturist and Chinese herbal medicine practitioner. And she had this Kripalu catalog that on the front had the Ayurveda school. And she said, "This is what you're doing next." And I was like, "What?" She's like, "This is what you should do next." And for whatever reason, I was like, okay. And that later that summer, I actually was walking around Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there are these people that sell books on the corner out of cardboard boxes. And I happened to pick up Ayurvedic Healing by David Frowley, just randomly. It just happened to be there. And so me being who I am, I was like, well, obviously that's a sign. So I went home and applied to Ayurveda school at Kripalu. And then the rest is just, one step after another, as they say. Then history happened and here I am.
Synchronicity is mind-blowing, isn't it?
It really is. It really is.
Yeah. And our choice to either see things as being synchronous or seeing things as being purely random and chaotic is also fascinating when we lean to the one and when we lean to the other. Yeah. So we know how Ayurveda. Why did you stay in Ayurveda? So you had started, you were studying different complementary forms of medicine. You studied conventional medicine. You were studying yoga. So there were a lot of pathways open to you. What made you keep going down the Ayurveda pathway?
I've always been someone who needs to figure out the truth of things, the reality of things, the kind of why behind everything. And Ayurveda has that why. There's always such a logic to everything in Ayurveda, as you know, right? The yukti is, if there's no yukti, it's not Ayurveda. Also coming to terms with the idea that everything is Ayurveda. It's just whether it's appropriate for you or not. That brings you to the fact that Ayurveda, being the system of life, being the science of life, being the study of life, means that it is the kind of user manual. And it is such a rabbit hole. But I've never found anything in it that I was like, that's bunk, that's not real, that doesn't work. Because the only times I've ever thought that was because I didn't understand the concept I was working with, or I needed a teacher like our teacher Anusha or any of the other wonderful teachers that I've studied with to explain it to me, to make it make sense. And then I started realizing, and I know, Dr. Douillard talks about this a lot, how modern science continuously proves Ayurveda. And that just socks it home too. I haven't seen any real legitimate studies that didn't prove concepts true in Ayurvedic medicine. It never lines up where it's the other way. Only times I ever see that is when it's a flawed study, or the money for the study is coming from someone who wants a specific result. And then those results aren't real anyway, so who cares? But like the Ayurveda kept coming back to the capital T truth. Like, I hate being a hypocrite and I hate not knowing. Although I've gotten pretty good at hanging out in the not knowing, because you kind of have to, because you can't know everything, despite our desperate attempts to try, right, Monaji? Like, we're trying really hard, hence the huge bookcases behind both of us. But that's the thing, like, that thirst for knowledge, that thirst for the truth, I keep coming back to Ayurveda time and time again, because it's all there. It's all there.
I was at the gym this morning, and the gentleman who runs the gym, it's sort of in his home. And so there's these windows and you can see outside, and we could see the sun coming in. And I made a comment last time I was there, those windows weren't there, so we weren't seeing the sun. And I said, wow, that's a really nice addition. It's really nice to see the sunrise as we're, practicing, moving our bodies, breathing. lifting, push-upping, whatever it was we were doing. And he said, yeah, he said, there's science around circadian medicine. And I looked at him and I was like, yeah, I know. I said, like, the sun salutations in yoga. I just gave like that super basic example. But I said to him, I said, I think you forgot what I do. As someone who studies Ayurveda, we're all about, like you said, this truth of life and living, right? The science of life. I love it. I'd love to hear more about your big why. And I have two whys that I'm curious about. Veronica doesn't know I'm about to ask this, even though we talked about all these questions like 5 minutes ago.
Love it.
Came for me in this moment. I'd love to hear, I think we've heard about the why of Ayurveda, right? So like in that way, it's there. Now I'd love to hear about the why of this podcast. So why are we here and why are we doing this at this time?
What a great question, Mona. Yeah, the why of this podcast. So it took me, we've been talking about doing a podcast. I've been talking about doing a podcast probably for over 2 or 3 years now. The idea has been percolating. And there's always that, like, what the heck do you name it? Right? Do you name it just like the Veronica Wolff-Casey podcast, or do you name it something else? I wanted to name it Ayurveda Saves Lives for a little while, but that didn't really seem appropriate. And so we ended up calling it the How to Take Care of Yourself podcast, because that's the question I want to answer for people, because that's what I see people failing to do. Like, that's the most common thing. I just see people not quite able to take care of themselves in some aspect of their life. And it's not that people are incompetent, and it's not that people don't have the capacity or the capability. It's just that the information that's out there is often contradictory. It's often very fad-based, where it's like they discover, I don't know, like the whole gluten-free thing. Like, there are some people like yourself, legitimately gluten-free, allergic to wheat. Cool. Totally get it. People who are celiac. Cool. Totally get it. But then there are people that jumped on the gluten-free bandwagon, A, not knowing what gluten was, and B, just because it was cool, right? I think it was Jimmy Kimmel that did a famous bit where he sent a man out on the street to ask people if they were gluten-free, and they'd say with this proud look on their face, I am absolutely gluten-free, as if it was like a new superpower. And then it'd be like, okay, so what's gluten? And their little faces would just drop because they didn't know. They had just jumped on this bandwagon. And I think that's common, like the Atkins diet, all of these different fads, intermittent fasting. What's interesting is all of those things have a place legitimately in the health world, in the Ayurveda world. But what's never really talked about then is the time and place, and then the science behind it, or the why behind it. And so I wanted to create a podcast where people could really come to hear the time and place, the reason why, what's the science behind it, when is it appropriate, when is it not appropriate, who is it appropriate for, how does that all play in together with a daily lifestyle? Because that's the other thing. People live these super busy lives. They don't have time to do all the research to figure it out for themselves. And so that's where we come in. That's where I come in. That's where I come in and say, okay, let's talk about that. Let's figure out why. And then let's put it through the Ayurvedic lens to make it make sense with logic. So that's my big why behind the podcast. And almost everything I do, I want to make people feel better so that they are nicer people. Really, it's a selfish why. I'm not going to lie. I want there to be less assholes on the planet. And I know that when I'm not feeling well, I'm an asshole. And so I know when I make myself feel better, I'm less of an asshole. And I can only imagine that that works for other people too. Right?
Yep. It reminds me of that, the shloka from the classics where they're talking about the utility of the science of Ayurveda. And it's really short. It's just 4 words: hita, ahita, sukha, dukkha. And they talk about hita means, is it useful? And so ahita means it's not useful. And then how do we know if something is useful or not useful? Does it create sukha, a sense of well-being in the system, or does it create dukkha, a sense of suffering in the system? And when we're suffering, even not that suffering cannot have utility, of course it does. We can learn a lot from our suffering. However, the idea behind it is to get out of it, right? Is to find ways to get out of it. And so, yeah, that's a beautiful big why. Beautiful big why. So the next question with that, so now we have a sense of the where and we have a sense of the why. But I think with the why for you, there's another component, which is your connection to and your being really drawn to food and cooking and kitchen medicine. And so how does this food, cooking, kitchen medicine tie into the podcast, into the why, into this whole process?
Really good question. So, and also one of my favorite questions you've asked so far. So I've literally been obsessed with food since I was about 3 or 4 years old when my grandma, my Nana, my mom's mom, Rita, which I know you and I have that in common. Both of our grandmothers have the same first name, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But Rita, she brought me into her kitchen at a very, like, I was in there probably before I remember, but definitely when I remember. And she really showed me about whole foods and real foods. And that was where I started to make connections between how food made us feel, not just on a physical level, but emotionally and mentally and even spiritually, right? We've all had food that was like an out of body experience, right? Where you're like, this is, as they often say, orgasmic, right? And so being so obsessed with food, I went through a really long food journey, which is a conversation for another time, but I basically like tried everything out. I'm actually a classically trained French chef. I went to the BU culinary program that was designed by Jacques Pepin and Julia Child. So I have all this training, worked in various restaurants, all sorts of stuff. But then I came to Ayurveda, and it even more solidified that connection of how food makes us feel. We literally are what we eat. And that's the most fundamental, that's the easiest way we can intervene in our well-being. Because I don't know anybody who doesn't have to eat, except for maybe some sadhus in India that have, transcended, right? But for the average,
we don't know them. We don't know
personally.
They're just out there. We don't know them.
We don't know them at all. So we can pretty much make an assessment that every single person we're going to encounter has to eat. And they have to eat food, preferably. So bringing people the simplicity of food, because I've been blown away in my journey, in my career so far, at how many people are super intimidated by food, by the kitchen. They're not sure how food works together. They're afraid of spices. They're afraid of even their stoves. Like, I've met people that are afraid to turn on their stoves because they're not sure what to do. And so it really became apparent that someone needed to intervene in this basic level, right? At this very beginner level, and show people not only what to eat, because that's a huge thing, but how to make it work for their bodies, because that's the part that's rarely talked about. Like, if I come across another kale and chickpea recipe, I'm going to throw up, because this is a combination, friends. And if you take nothing else away from this podcast, take this. Do not eat kale and chickpeas together. You will fart. You will blow up like a balloon. You'll never digest another thing in your life. Now, it's a little dramatic, but it's true. It's like people don't understand about food combining. They don't understand how spices play this pivotal role, how cooking your food is so important, how consuming your food is so important. Like, raise your hand if you've eaten while driving, right? We've all done it. Or if you eat while standing, you don't think about how important it is to relax while you eat. And then you wonder why you have indigestion or acid reflux or, God forbid, IBS, right? And because it didn't seem like common knowledge, I really started leaning into that. And taking all of my chef skills to people's houses through my newsletter and through cooking for yoga retreats and things like that. Yeah,
It's a thing.
it's totally a thing.
Food's a thing. So, how about sharing with the audience a little bit more about what they can expect in terms of the podcast and upcoming episodes and different ideas you have around what that's going to look like? Will you be on your own? Will you have guests? Tell us a little bit about this idea of the podcast and over these past few years of contemplation, what came out the other side? What can we expect?
Absolutely. So I I had a really hard time pinning it down. And so then I decided I didn't have to pin it down. Because if we're going to talk about Ayurveda, we're going to talk about how to take care of yourself. It's not like there's one aspect that's going to be the secret key to your success. And because I hopefully will be reaching millions of people, we have to talk about a wide spectrum of topics. Everything from interpersonal relationships to your relationship with yourself to how to exercise, how to eat, from taking the fads that do come through the news and showing what and where they can be used, if they can be used, what's the science behind it, like I was talking about earlier. And then I really want to talk to experts in the field, not just the Ayurvedic field, but all across the board, wellness expert, relationship experts, psychologists, mental health experts, right? The sky's the limit is really where I want to go here. And then I want to have reoccurring segments with people like Mona Warner, our co-host for today, and then conversations with, believe it or not, my husband, Kevin Casey, who is this profound, deep thinker. And there's been so many times when we've just been having a random conversation at the breakfast table. I'm like, totally should have recorded that because there's all these tidbits that he comes out with. He's this sage that always has these wonderfully profound things to say. And I wanted to have that. And then different segments with my teachers like Annie Hoffman and Anusha Segal and Joseph Satlak, these people that have had a profound effect on my life and my learning, because I don't want to gatekeep anything from anyone. I want everyone to have the same resources, same ability, same information so that they can really find what resonates for them. And you never know what's going to be the one thing or the several things that gets people to that next level where they really feel swasta, seated in the self. Right? So I know it's a grand vision and it's going to be just, a process. We're all going to go through it together and we'll see what happens.
Awesome. Yeah, it's exciting. I often think of our friend Sarah and how she's all about possibility, right? And there's always such a sweet spot when we're in that seat of all the possibility. And it'll be fun to see how it unfolds and where it evolves into, right? Because I think there also has to be room for evolution because we don't know what we don't know.
Until we know we don't know.
And then until we know, and then it's a whole different ball game. Whole different ball game. So is there anything else that you want to share before I come to our every guest final question?
I think I just want to share my hope, and my wish is that if I can help, and I know it's going to sound cheesy, like everybody always says this, like if I can just help one person, then my life will be complete. But I really mean that. Like if I can help just one person through this podcast, if one person takes something away that changes their life for the better in any small way, then I'm going to feel successful. Right. So I know there are podcasters out there that are all about downloads and subscribers. And absolutely, I hope you subscribe. I hope you download, like help me reach more people, because that's part of it. Like the more you help me reach more people, the more people we can help. And I'm a firm believer in building community that way. But I really am sincere when I say I'm here to help you, the listener, have a better life. That's what it's all about for me. And so don't be shy if you have questions and you want them answered, or there are topics that you really wish someone would talk about. And if it's an embarrassing topic that you're like, God, I never got to ask this question to anyone, but I can send it anonymously to Veronica and she'll figure it out for me. Absolutely, go for it. There's no question too small, no question too embarrassing. I really want people to feel empowered to use me and all the people I know, like Mona and Anusha and everyone else, as a resource to live better lives, because that's really your birthright, is health and well-being.
Beautifully said. And I don't think it's cheesy. I think it's noble. You know, I think there's a nobility in wanting to help and support others. I think that's why we are such good friends, because we're so on the same page that way, you know? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. As part of Veronica's vision, she wanted to have a question that she asks every guest at the end of each episode. And so here is the final question. Doesn't mean it's the final thing we'll talk about. It's the final official, this is the every guest question. So it's exciting to ask you, knowing that you're going to be asking all these other people. And at some point, you're going to ask me this question. So I'm already having to figure out my answer. However, sorry, everyone else who didn't know there was a question that they were going to be asked. And I know, so I can prepare. But this is the advantage of knowing the host really, really well. So the question is, what have you learned from the food that you eat?
What have I learned from the food that I eat? We worked hard to figure out what this question should be, so I'm honored and excited to be the first one to answer it. I have learned how important it is to eat food that's appropriate for my hunger. And so this is something that I think gets overlooked all the time, and I do it because I get super excited about food. You may have seen me earlier getting like crazy. And if you're listening to this instead of watching it, I get a little cuckoo bananas when it comes to food. And I have to be careful, because if I'm not hungry and I eat, I'll get sick. Like, I won't be throwing up or anything, but I'll immediately get nauseous and be like, I poked the bear. And I like to say I lost my LA privileges, because now I have to wait even longer to get hungry again. And so what I've learned about the food that I eat is that I really have to respect the food and my Agni, my digestive fire. And I have to make sure, and it's such a core Ayurvedic principle, it feels almost trite to bring it into this question, although I think it's really germane to the conversation, is that you have to eat to your Agni. So that's been the big lesson I've been learning as late. And I fully expect the answer to this question to change, both for me and for other people. So don't be surprised if I have a repeat guest on and I ask them this question again and they'll give a different answer, because that's part of our evolution as humans, is our relationship to both food and our bodies and how the food makes our bodies feel. So that's my big takeaway. And maybe that's your takeaway too from the podcast today, is that you really have to watch your hunger and make sure that the food you're eating is appropriate, both in quantity and quality.
That's a good one. And I suspect with that question, Agni is going to come back again and again and again and again.
For sure.
A lot of Agni. Om Agni.
Om Agni, indeed.
So, any last thoughts, ideas, or shares?
Mostly just super grateful that you could be here to do this, Mona G. Like, I want that to be out there in the airwaves, that you are awesome for doing this. But really, my hope is that people will click subscribe and get notified about new episodes as they come out. The dream is that this will be a bi-weekly podcast, so coming out every other week. You know, what that is going to look like in the future, I'm not entirely sure. We've got to line up our guests. The whole idea was just to start getting things running. So stay tuned, bear with us, stick with us, because we're really going to, I think, give you an incredible resource for your health and your well-being. And hopefully you'll be amused and entertained along the way.
That is very likely to happen.
Because even if other people don't think we're hilarious, Mona and I both think we're both hilarious. And I think she's hilarious. And I have suspicions she thinks I'm pretty darn funny too.
It's true. All of the above, all these boxes being checked, all the Pitta friends out there, check, 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 check. Yes. Agreed. So I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, me. That feels weird. I think I'm going to ask you to cut that and you're not going to cut it because I've done this whole thing where I'm asking you to cut that part because it's weird. But I mean, we just need to know weird is probably going to be part of this whole process because that's a little bit how and who we are. So I want to thank everyone so much for joining us on the very first How to Take Care of Yourself podcast. And we look forward to connecting again soon.
Thank you, Mona.
Thank you, Veronica G. Thanks, everyone.
So that was our episode for today, friends. Thank you so much for listening. Do me a favor before you leave, hit like and hit subscribe so that these platforms know that you enjoyed this content and that we can keep bringing you the content that you so love. And speaking of love, if no one's told you yet today, I love you and I'm convinced of your capacity to continue crafting a life worth living. Stay healthy, my friends. See you next time.